On today's special crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On Oilers, forget Kirill, Kaprizov, and Connor McDavid. It's time for Jonas Brodin to do his thing once again.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers and Locked On Wild. I am Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers. That is Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild. I want to thank everyone who's making this their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers and Locked On Wild, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can get the season started with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $150 in bonus bets. If you win your first $5 bet, visit FanDuel.com to get started. Seth, my friend, hello. We're playing hockey today.
Yeah, it's exciting to see these two teams square off for the first time this year because it turns out these matchups have been exciting, to say the least, over the last couple of years. Plenty of star power, and I am excited to see how this year's Minnesota Wild stacks up against this year's Edmonton Oilers.
So that's a good way to transition to the first topic I wanted to broach, which is what's different this year about the Wild from last year. Help me give Oiler fans an understanding of what's driven such a strong start. You know, the Wild, on paper, relatively similar team. The one thing that jumps out, obviously, Jared Spurgeon being healthy. But what's different this year, aside from healthy Jared Spurgeon for the Wild?
I'm going to use two words that John Hynes has used almost every game this year: mindset and mentality. And that has been a huge focus of what this team has tried to do to distance themselves from last year's failure to make the playoffs. Hynes has talked a ton about just getting in the right mindset to be able to attack a game, attack adversity, and to get yourself ready for the entirety of what is always a grueling NHL season. It was, by all reports from Minnesota Wild players, one of the most challenging training camps that have happened in recent memory for this Minnesota Wild team. And I think it helped kind of instill what is going to be needed to win close games, to beat tough teams. It was a Wild team that last year, as Ryan Hartman said himself, just too easy to play against. Like they didn't have any sort of oomph. They didn't have any sort of, fight back. And that has been a big part of the puzzle this year for the Wilds. They are a team that is not afraid of adversity. They've handled some of it already so far this year. But I think the big thing, Nick, is Philip Gustafson is probably the best statistical goalie in the NHL right now. Leads the league in goals against average and is number 2, I think, in save percentage, and just continues to put together a season that is every bit as strong as the one he had 2 years ago, where I spent most episodes screaming that he should be one of the Vezina finalists. And of course he wasn't, but he has put together a year that is equally as good, if not better. And it's more consistent. Of the games that he's played so far this year, he's had maybe 2 clunkers. That's it. And this Wild team is built on goaltending and defense. And those 2 units have been so good this year that it has helped an offense that is pretty top heavy in my estimation. Obviously, Kirill and Matt Boldy, who we'll talk about as the show unfolds. But it's been the defense and the goaltending that I think have led to this team being able to pick up the second most points in the NHL to this point, and to make it look like last year is a distant memory, which is something that everybody that watches this team, that covers this team, that's what we were all hoping for when the season started.
Because that's what the Wild have always been, dating back to the Suter days. It's always been a defense and goaltending organization. And when they've been at their best historically in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been driven by strong team defense. For the Oilers, it's weird. You would think a team that did lose quite a bit of talent. You lose Ryan McLeod, you lose Dylan Holloway, you lose Warren Foegele, but you replace those guys with Arvidsson, with Jeff Skinner. You figured a full season of Adam Henrique would offset that. Yeah, you lost Cody Ceci, who had a lot of experience, but was quite a knucklehead and made a lot of boneheaded mistake. So you figured maybe a little bit lower ceiling player, but a little less volatile would work. And the Oilers to start the season have been very disjointed. This doesn't look like a team that went to the Stanley Cup final last year. It's been a lot of stop and start, and well, it's a 1-goal game. Is Connor or Leon going to do something and get us back in this game, or are we going to lose tonight? And I think there's no better encapsulation of that than Monday night losing the way they did against Montreal versus last night coming out and blowing Ottawa out of the building. You don't know what you're going to get on any given night, which makes the potential for this game very intriguing that I have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because I think back to last year where the Wild got off to just that hideous start. They were 5-14 through the first 19 games of the season. And you start off the season by shutting out the eventual Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers. And we're like, hey, maybe we got something here. And then things just systematically start to fall apart from there. But that Oilers game early on between these two teams, in which the Wild won 7-4, was kind of one of those where we're like, is this going to be what gets everything back on track? Or is this just going to be, like getting above water when you're trying to tread water? Like, is this just, coming up for air one time before you go back under? And they lost like 8 in a row after that game. So, but these matchups have been exciting. Like, one matchup that I'm really excited to dive into later in the show, Jonas Brodin, who has been like that number one cover corner going up against Connor McDavid over the years. And Brodin missed a few games. He's back now. He scored the game-winning goal against St. Louis. So he's going to be key. But like, how, for you covering the show, and I know a little bit about how this feels with Kirill, for you covering the Oilers, how does it feel to every day wake up and just be like, hey, I've got Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl on this roster? Like, I can't imagine.
It's the same feeling I had as a Met fan every time DeGrom would get the ball, where, okay, we got a chance today. And that's really how it feels with McDavid and Draisaitl. You're never really out of any game. Like, they were losing 2-0 to Montreal and there were 4 minutes left. And still in the back of my head, I was like, all they need is one. It's not like Montreal's good at defense. And it's a double-edged sword. And I talk about this a lot, the burden of greatness, the idea that you have a lot of talent. It's incumbent upon you to capitalize on it. And that's really one of the big stories in the NHL. How do you get that great team to break through? Because the Oilers have been around the periphery for a few years now. They went to the conference finals kind of by accident 2 years ago and got smoked by Colorado, who went on to win the Stanley Cup. Last year, they got to the second round, injuries again. And then this past season, they got within a goal of winning the Stanley Cup. They've been floating around. And we have seen consistently now teams that are close, they don't want to reimagine their roster. They want to tinker around the edges. And that was the gamble the Oilers took. They let an interim GM handle all of their free agency and their early offseason. They hired a replacement. They've hired a full-time general manager with like 2 weeks to go in August. And it kind of feels like everything is still getting thrown together. They have injuries up the butt now, too. No Arvidsson, no Darnell Nurse. You've got lingering questions about Zach Hyman, who may or may not be able to go tomorrow night, too. So it's definitely a lot to happen all in one offseason. And I think, I don't want to say that's the excuse, but that's the reason the Oilers are very inconsistent right now. They had a lot of change in a short period of time.
Yeah, it's like what happens to the Minnesota Wild last year, where you have, I don't even know how many players were out of the lineup, and you're like, okay, now we've got to replace this guy, or now we got to try to figure out how to fill this spot in the top 6. Like, it just never ends. But it speaks to the makeup of the roster to make sure that you have enough guys to cover all those key spots. Which is why it's great to have players like Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Kirill Kaprizov, and Matt Boldy. And I know we're going to talk way more about that in segment 2 because we're going to get a chance to see these 4 go toe-to-toe in person.
Coming up right after this. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. With Prize Picks, you can win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in over 30 states, including California, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. Join over 10 million users and sign up today. Open the Prize Picks app or head on over to their website. You can do whether Nathan McKinnon is going to have more than half a goal, if Evan Bouchard is going to have more than 3.5 shots on goal, or if Philip Gustafson is going to have more than 25.5 saves. Download the Prize Picks app or visit the website and use code LOCKEDONNHL and get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Remember, download the Prize Picks app and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Next week, American Thanksgiving on Thursday. I am going to Devils Blues on Wednesday night as opposed to going out in my hometown and avoiding people I went to high school with. The only place I get tickets to go to games to avoid people I went to high school with is from our friends over at Game Time. And through Game Time, they have an exclusive zone deal for the NHL Winter Classic event at Wrigley Field. Go to the Game Time app, get 10% off bleacher seats and 20 to 25% off home plate area seats. My personal favorite thing about using Game Time is the in-seat view, where you can see the view from your seat ahead of time. So download the Game Time app and use code LOCKEDONNHL. Again, one last time, download the Game Time app, use code LOCKEDONNHL as the code. What time is it? Game time. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out here with Seth and I on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers and Locked On Wild. So I want to ask you this question about Kaprizov, because the Wild use him on the power play in a very similar way to the Oilers do with McDavid, where sometimes the power play is he just skates the perimeter of the zone with the puck and waits for the play to develop. Do you ever just sit back and damn? I remember I was at a Devils Oilers game a few years ago, and a random guy was sitting next to me, and he punches me on the arm, and he goes, "Does he do that all the time?" And I'm like, yes, he does.
I find myself just being amazed by what Kirill does on a daily basis, literally every time I see him play. And that was, and probably still is, his signature play is just the perimeter walk of the offensive zone. And it's so fun too, having covered Kaprizov now for the last 3.5 seasons, you know when he's starting to get rolling and when it's okay, it's game takeover time for Kaprizov. And I think the thing that surprises me the most about what he does is just how elite his on-ice vision is. There have been multiple instances this year, and what I'm about to tell you is something that probably should, the odds of it happening multiple times are low enough as it is, let alone once. He has executed full 360 spinorama passes to perfectly set up goals multiple times this season. He had one in which he was kind of skating around behind the net on the right side, full 360 pass to Matt Zuccarello further up on the left side of the ice. And the goalie was like, well, I'm obviously going to pay attention to Kirill. I'm obviously going to follow him. And Zuccarello had a wide open net. Against Florida, he took the puck and skated around behind Sergei Bobrovsky and deked him completely out of the net. The things that he does and the plays that he sets up are unbelievable. I think the craziest goal I've ever seen him score, other than the full 360 behind the net, slam it home against the Kings in his rookie year, he had in the playoffs against the Blues 2 seasons ago. He had a goal against Ville Husso that he put in off of the back of Husso's head into the net for a goal. He was basically he had about a 3-degree window, and he's like, well, I'm definitely scoring here. So he scores it off of Husso, the back of his head. And and those are just expected goals for him. He expects to score in those types of situations. And he has, I think, been on just a mission this year because he was hurt to start the year last year, got off to a slower start than we're used to. He finished obviously incredibly strong, but it seems like this year he is on a mission. And that was one of the really interesting things after the season ended last year, was just how hard he took not getting to the postseason. He seems like he is single-handedly trying to will this team to get to the playoffs this year and to do better than that. Nothing surprises me that he does anymore, but it also seems like there are things in the bag yet that we haven't seen that I'm like, oh boy, this is gonna like change the game or just take this Wild franchise to the next level. But that's just who he is. That's just what he does.
And that's the thing. And that's what I always tell my casual hockey friends whenever I throw on, like, if I throw on like Oilers Stars in the background while we're hanging out on a Saturday, they're like, why are you watching this? And like, first of all, I do an Oilers podcast. I talk about this pretty frequently. Second of all, look up every now and then when 97 has the puck. And the thing that always gets me about when you put McDavid highlights on in front of a casual or a non-logical hockey person, they go, he made that look really easy. And that's the thing about Kaprizov too. Draisaitl does this too. Boldy's shot in particular does this, where they're doing these things that maybe 10 other people on the entire planet can do. And they do that like I tie my shoes. They skate with such fluidity. I mean, that's what makes Kaprizov so dangerous, is the effortlessness in which he's able to change direction, get side to side, the agility. And that doesn't even get into the puck skills. We're like, McDavid's not a great shooter of the puck, but because he can get the puck to anywhere, he doesn't need to be. You know, he's only 70th percentile in like dangerous shot quality, 70th percentile in shot velocity, but he doesn't need to be great. He doesn't need to have a howitzer because he's so smart. I mean, one question I did want to ask you while we're on the subject of individual players, it was really good to see Rossi stick last year. What's enabled him to really kind of finally break through? Was it just simply opportunity after the long recovery?
I think so. And there was a key moment where his rookie season, his quote unquote rookie season, 19 games in, it just really wasn't working. He had 1 point in the 19 games. He was playing more of a bottom six role. And Bill Guerin had a chat with him and told him, you know, we want you to get a little bit more of an FU attitude down in Iowa. And he did that. And he has come back since and just been a completely different player. Like, he prides himself in being a net front guy. And he was mixing it up last year, a game against the Jets. Logan Stanley had a hit after the whistle against Kirill Kaprizov. And who comes to Kirill's defense? Marco Rossi, one of the smallest players on the team. And he's going up toe-to-toe against Logan Stanley, who's like 6'10". He's fearless, and I think that attitude has just allowed him to do a lot of different things that you wouldn't expect him to be able to do. But he is, other than Joel Eriksson-Ek, he's maybe the most important net front player on this team. But he has won faceoffs at a much higher rate this year, and he is just like, he has turned himself into a staple in the top six for this Minnesota Wild team so far. And you look back even like 2 years ago, and we were questioning, those that cover the Minnesota Wild were questioning like the center depth for this Wild team. And all of a sudden now you got Joel Eriksson-Ek, who just is never talked about enough as a center in the NHL. You got Marco Rossi in that mix, and there are some young players that are expected to help inject more into that mix. But I'll leave you with the quote, I think one of the best quotes I think I've ever heard in my life, that perfectly encapsulates what Marco Rossi brings to this Minnesota Wild team. After a game last year in which he scored, I think it was he had the game-winning goal. I know there was a game he had a hat trick, and there was another he had a game-winning goal. And he was asked after the game, you know, what has allowed you to find just this next level to your game? And he said, every day I come to the rink and I just try to work hard and do my best. And I'm like, boy, if you had a full roster of guys that just did that, like, you're going to have a pretty good team. And so he's been a perfect encapsulation of like what this Wild team needs to do until they can utilize all of the salary cap, or at least more of it than they currently can. he's a perfect encapsulation of like what this team needs to do to consistently win games. And he's off to a pretty good start this year. Until Matt Zuccarello got hurt, he was the number one center between Kaprizov and Zuccarello. So obviously his game has really ratcheted up. He's put himself in position to be a key piece for this Minnesota Wild team going forward too.
So we're going to take one more final break on today's show. We come back, we're going to tackle some of the surprise players and some of the things we're excited to see about these teams going to head coming up after this break.
Today's episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Oilers is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, or you want to see the Minnesota Vikings try to recreate their immaculate comeback in the second half against the Indianapolis Colts, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here with Seth and I ahead of tonight's Oilers and Wild showdown. All right, Seth, who's surprising you the most on the Wild? Because I've been surprised by the Wild at large, so I'm sure there are more than one person we could talk about.
Yeah, there have been a few players that had, I wouldn't say disappointing seasons, but definitely didn't live up to the expectations last year. But I think the guy that has really taken an important step for this Minnesota Wild team so far this year is Matt Boldy. And, you know, Humble Brag had a chance to interview him before the season started and asked him a little bit about, you know, you are rapidly becoming, if you're not already there, the number 2 scoring option on this team. How do you handle all that pressure and all those expectations? And his answer is one of my favorite that I think I've heard in that type of question. He said, "It's not pressure, it's opportunity." And I'm like, okay, this guy gets it. But there have been some subtle tweaks that have been made to his game, and I think John Hines had a lot to do with that in identifying some things that he could improve upon. And so credit to Boldy as well for taking the time in the offseason to work on it and to put himself in position to be where he's at. Second on the team in goals. He's got 10 in 18 games. He's on pace for, I think, 46 goals right now. But the other part of this that is really impressive is last year he was injured early on. He had 1 goal in the first 19 games of the season. John Hines took over. He had 28 in the final 56. And so far this year, he, as mentioned, has 10 in the first 18 games. So he erased that slow start, and he has given the Wild a viable number 2 behind Kirill Kaprizov to where, you know, especially on the power play, like if Kirill is in playmaker mode, Boldy's got that one-timer that he can just rifle at the net. And so I would say the expectations for Boldy were pretty high coming into the season. But so far this year, I think he has far exceeded what I expected he would be able to do. And he shows no signs of letting up or slowing down, because not only does his offense look really, really good, his defense has taken a big step forward too.
You're going to laugh when I name a player who doesn't have a single goal yet as somebody who's exceeded my expectations, but Podkolzin's been great at being a crash test dummy. Like, he just flings himself at people full velocity 2 or 3 times a night, wins a forecheck. I mean, he started the year on the 4th line on the left wing with Derek Ryan and Corey Perry, and they got off to the slow start. They were 4-5-1 after 10 games, and they bumped Podkolzin up to play with Draisaitl. They have since demoted Jeff Skinner, who played on the 4th line on Tuesday and Monday, as a matter of fact. And on Tuesday, playing with McDavid and Draisaitl, they have a player who doesn't have a single goal on the season. And it was a really good exercise in psychology, because when they played those two together with Hyman on Monday, They didn't have a single 5-on-5 scoring chance, either of them, and Hyman had all of their 5-on-5 scoring chances. So in putting Podkolzin with them, it was a subtle way for Chris Knoblauch to force them to shoot the puck. And it let Podkolzin do what he does best, which is effectively being a dog chase a tennis ball. The puck gets down low, he goes and gets it. And the Oilers don't have the forecheckers they did last year. I mentioned in the opening segment, Fogle and McLeod, those were their two best forecheckers last year. No Evander Kane either. I know he didn't play in the playoffs last year, but through the regular season when he was playing, one of their more effective forecheckers. They didn't really replace that skill set. Like the Arvidsson and Skinner are both talented hockey players, but they're kind of redundant to what the Oilers already have. So Podkolzin, who was a flyer they got in a salary dump trade, is really doing a nice job of just being annoying and forechecking well, because he's basically their only forechecker. Corey Perry tries, but he's 38 years old. He's not winning a lot of foot races. And Derek Ryan, mid-30s and slow. So you need these types of guys. And eventually he's going to get a goal on every single Oilers broadcast. They keep making the joke, just keep the stick on the ice. They'll get him one eventually by accident. And it probably will at some point, but it's nice to see.
Yeah, and there are those types of guys are needed on every team because as much as you want to have like a top six that can give you goals and points and can get you the lead and can extend it, you've got to have guys that can get the play started. You got to have guys that can get the offense set up and be able to get you entrenched in the offensive zone or keep a team from doing the same on the other end. One other player that I wanted to talk about because I was really a fan of what he brought to the team once I learned a little bit more about him. Jakub Lauko, who he's got great speed. The points haven't been there yet. He's got 4 points in 18 games, 2 goals, 2 assists, but he hits everything that moves. He's like a bowling ball in the back of a moving van. Is the analogy that I'm going to use. And it's just like you put him on the ice and he's going to go get somebody big hits. Another player that has, I think, helped with that a little bit more recently is Yakov Trenin, who was brought in from Nashville just to try to be a little more bite, a little insurance for Marcus Foligno, who, to his credit, has not missed a game yet this year and I think has played some really good hockey so far this season. So Trenin's been kind of figuring out where he fits on this roster. But one area, Nick, that I'm really intrigued to see, because I've talked about him a little bit on the national show. Talk to me a little bit about Stuart Skinner, because I feel pretty confident in what Philip Gustafson's going to do on a nightly basis. But, the numbers for Skinner and just in knowing what I know about kind of how he is operated, he can get on a roll. He can get on a really good roll, but it seems like there are nights more often than not where there are a couple of goals that you look at and you're like, oh boy, you'd really like to have that one back.
He's an extreme confidence player. Like you said, when he's feeling his game, he can play with anyone. He outplayed Ottinger in the Western Conference Finals last year, and Ottinger's pretty consensus top 10 goalie in the league. The thing this year, and why it's a particularly more glaring, is the fact that the Oilers took money out of their defense and the guys they lost, put it all into forwards. They made the defense worse. They have, I think it's the 28th most expensive goalie tandem in the league. Skinner and Pickard combined make like $3 million. So they've clearly de-emphasized defense in the way they've chosen to spend money and on their goaltending. And I don't want to say you get what you pay for, but this is kind of what you're paying for. You're paying for bottom 5 goaltending and you're getting bottom 5 goaltending. Skinner's better than this. Like the team at large is better than this. They're not this bad, especially offensively. They're still below league average in goals. I think they're 1 below the league average total for actual goals scored so far. The power play is still in the high teens. Their penalty kill is in the bottom 10. Once those start to come around, and if Skinner is still playing poorly, then I think it merits a little bit more of a conversation. But I'll leave you with this as a parting thought on Skinner before we wrap. My entire ethos during the playoffs last year was, if Stuart Skinner needs to be the guy, you're going to lose. If Stuart Skinner is a guy, you're going to win the game. And more often than not in the playoffs, if he didn't have to be the difference between winning and losing, they found a way to make it happen. But if you're in those 2-1, 3-2 nail biters against Bobrovsky, Bobrovsky's going to win the staring contest. That's just the way it works. He's a better goalie.
Yeah, that's well said. I like that. And it's kind of how I feel about, those key aspects of teams. Like we have got the old adage of you can get into the postseason and you can advance in the postseason with a so-so power play, but you can't if you have a so-so penalty kill. And the Wilds, the numbers are better this year. I mean, you can't get any worse than third to last, I guess, other than being dead last. But it's just one of those things too. Like if you can turn a weakness or a weak point into just not glaring, you can do some good things in this league. And I know well enough with the weapons that the Oilers have that if this game turns into a penalty fest, I lean Oilers because I don't have full trust in the Wild penalty kill to do their job more often than not. And so my hope always in these types of games against the key teams or the superstar laden teams is just keep it 5-on-5 and just let Jonas Brodin do his thing against Connor McDavid, as he always does. But I'm looking forward to what should be a great game between these two. There have been very few like lopsided games. These always seem to be tight games, 1 or 2 goals, and it's just fun to see superstars fully execute their craft out there on the ice, whether it be McDavid, Draisaitl, Kaprizov, Boldy, you name it. Both teams have some good talent, and I think this is going to be a fun one tonight.
Got to shout out Brock Faber and Evan Bouchard. Went almost a whole episode without talking about either of those guys. But when we're talking about superstars, Faber's right there. I know he's on the young side, only got the 1 season of experience, but he's a guy. He's most definitely a guy. And same thing with Bouchard. Last year was kind of his coming out party as well. Really established himself. So that'll do it for this crossover edition of Locked On Oilers and Locked On Wild. Want to thank everyone who listened to today's episode. Go throw Seth a follow. Go subscribe on YouTube. Go subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave reviews. Help your creators. Please, we beg of you. I will talk to you guys tomorrow after the Wild game.